Hello, ladies and gents, it's Hagbard Celine here on another beautiful afternoon, and today we're going to be reading an essay that was written by someone that I regularly associate with, who I think has encapsulated a very succinct understanding of the problems that we're having surrounding the word racism in the West at large and in America specifically in the last few years. On racism. Some thoughts on the word racism. Have you ever heard anyone say something positive about racism? Probably not. Since at least the 1990s, racism has pretty much been seen as the worst thing in the world here in the West. And even proud racists would like to avoid being publicly called one. Not completely undeserving, of course, in our post-Holocaust, post-American slavery, and post-segregation world. You go through quite a lot of different subjects and themes throughout your school years. Most of it you just forget, but some of it stays. One of the things that really gets drilled in was racism. It was a theme that would pop up very often, and it would pretty much always be associated with Nazism. Hitler and the Nazis slaughtered Jews, gypsies, and others because they were different, started a war, and invaded our country. The ultimate evil. This is racism. When the Nazis came up, it would lead to talking about racism and genocide. If racism come up, it would lead to Nazis and genocide. The association was created. They were very hard to separate. So is that a problem? In theory, I see a few problems with it. There's obviously a connection there, where the Nazis' racism dehumanized the Jews and others until they could justify any behavior against them. But, on the other hand, the quite constant talk about racism and association with the worst people in the world creates a hypersensitivity among pupils. When I grew a few years older, I really noticed how much accusations of racism were thrown around, especially in political discussion, not among top politicians though, and especially by young people. It's the go-to accusation if you find anything that you can tie to racism. The reason was obvious. People would get on the defensive at once if they were accused of something like that. It was in everyone's eyes like saying you were enabling a Hitler, or even being a Hitler. Basically an accusation of being pure evil. On the other hand, the accuser signals that they are against racism, and thus the good guy, even if the accusation itself is nonsensical. Of course, it being nonsensical is hard to prove, which further underlies why it's such a nice weapon against people you disagree with. Being a racist is something you are, not something you do, and it's impossible to disprove you aren't once you've been branded as one. The excuses often come in classic forms. I have many friends who are black, or I don't see color. Lines that sound a bit corny and condescending and have become somewhat of a meme today, and even often branded as racist in itself. But really, if you're being accused of the thought crime of being literally Hitler, having good black friends probably means you aren't. The ridicule and condemnation of such excuses are a deliberate creation of a catch-22. If you've been accused of racism and try to argue out of it, you're definitely a racist. All this leads us to have to question, what does racism really mean? The most intuitive meaning is that it's an ideology or ideologies, an ism, around race. Generally, how some are inferior and others superior. That's not how most people nowadays define it, though. The general consensus is that it's discrimination of any form towards someone of another race, ethnicity, or similar. This seems a bit odd. How can people believe racism could be something as simple as being slightly prejudiced, but at the same time connect it heavily to the extreme end of racism, like the Holocaust and slavery? One would think that if this was the case, most people would shrug off these accusations. The answer is probably that the ingrained association doesn't go away so easily, and also the idea of any type of discrimination, however tiny, can become the big bad Nazi monster, if given any chance. It's just the first step. This creates an environment where you justify constantly holding everyone down to not unleash any scary ideas. The irony in all this is that the people complaining about racism, let's call them anti-racists, are the ones obsessed with race, and thus are by this new and very open definition very racist. That's probably one of the reasons why it's very important for them to shut down the excuse given over here of I don't see color. This is above all an excuse, but also reflects on the original accuser, saying that they do. They call it racist because it annuls a large part of the minority person in question's identity and experiences, or something else vague. But what it really does is to annul their claims of low-level racism. One way anti-racists, above all in the US, where racial issues and politics have a long history, have used to combat this problem is to simply redefine the word further. Suddenly, when they talk of racism, they mean institutionalized power and prejudice. At first glance, you might think that this means that racism, in their eyes, means institutionalized racism, which is strange, but not too bad. But there's really more to it than that. The real intent seems to be to find a way that you can fit all white people into the definition while excluding non-whites, and above all, black people. That they just don't say so instead of making a much vaguer definition is revealing in itself. But this definition is often followed by someone stating something like, you can't be racist against whites, or its cousin, reverse racism doesn't exist, or black people can't be racist, or something similar. Just plain institutionalized racism doesn't allow for such differences. Of course, it's easy to see that in the West, most institutions are dominated by the majority white population. But it doesn't exclude a minority using institutional power that they have gained to discriminate against a white person, which would be racism too, even if he's a minor player overall. Also, very importantly, normal white people's discriminatory actions are considered racist, while at the same time, the ones from black people are not. To understand this train of thought, one could take a look at Francesca Ramsey's internet series Decoded, where you'll probably find American radical anti-racist ideas presented in the shortest and most coherent way possible for outsiders. What's interesting about her channel is she usually tries to argue for the talking points instead of just stating them, and also presents relevant talking points together. The result is often just front row seats to how weak the basis for these points are, and even how the basis behind one point often contradicts the one for the next point. In the linked video, her most relevant points besides the definition are, you can be a good person and still be racist, there's no such thing as reverse racism, and black people can be prejudiced but not racist. So all whites can be racist, but blacks can only be prejudiced. While prejudice isn't a nice word, it doesn't have anything close to the baggage that racism holds. In short, it puts the level of racial injustice all whites can do towards racial minorities higher on the scale than vice versa. This still holds true in situations where what they do is essentially the same. The black guy killing a white person for being white is prejudiced, while a white man killing a black person for being black is racist. Even more absurd is when the situations are completely skewed. Like, a white woman asking an Asian-looking girl where she's from gets slammed with the word, with associations of genocide, while the people torturing a white guy for days for being white is just prejudiced. This distinction gets absurd pretty fast, but as I've laid out here, it seems to be 100% intentional. It's also worth noting how Francesca tries to legitimize this new definition. The dictionary definition is called simple, and shot down with a completely nonsensical analogy. The new definition, on the other hand, is backed up with a terrible appeal to authority. Let's make it completely clear. Words mean what people put into them. Dictionaries, while obviously used to look up word meanings and thus set somewhat of a standard, have to be updated along with the population's changing perceptions of that word's meaning. The ultimate implication of Francesca's argument is that words have a correct meaning behind it that's set in stone. Something you can know, something you can research your way to. Almost like she thinks our language is something given to us by God and printed into our brains, instead of something we've slowly constructed to best serve as our way to communicate. This is important to understand because it seems to be completely lost on quite a lot of people. I don't think that includes Francesca Ramsey. I just think she's extremely intellectually dishonest. I've been linked this definition as if it's some argument in itself. It's like you can pin a new definition to a bad word and use it as an argument as to why this new definition is now a problem. We want to hear how and why it's a problem, backed up by evidence. But it seems that a lot of people have found manipulating language to be much more successful than pushing evidence. What's interesting and special about racism in particular is that it has, as talked a lot about earlier, very strong feelings attached to it. Now, that doesn't make the definition set in stone, although they do steer the definition a bit. So the definition is still somewhat malleable, while the feelings attached to it will remain. This has made the word racism a very potent weapon to suppress opposing views, and that is certainly how it's been put to use, and is still very actively used all the time. When all is said, it must be mentioned that I'm not trying to stop people from pointing out racism. What I'm after is for people to be more aware of the words they use, and how others are very deliberately using them to manipulate the discussion. The racism debate is so toxic, emotional, and messy that we all need some clarity to get somewhere. There's a lot of people who think manipulation and shaming are the best ways to keep racism in check, but I don't think that's sustainable. And down the line, that will only make things worse, maybe sooner than later. I'll be leaving a link to the original of this in the description here, as well as a link to a Slate article that I think is interesting and somewhat related to the points he brings up specifically about the word racism here, and the way that it's used, insofar as it's used for emotional effect. Now, in this Slate article, it's argued that this is the way of the future. This is the way that people should interact politically with one another, is to use framing, which is, interestingly, a term I've only heard used by pickup artists and marketers, and redefine or shift words to emotional connotations in an attempt to win new political discourse in the future. It's amazing, and I'll be linking that as well. I advise you peruse it, as well as some of the hot links in it, where they actually link to several articles that straight out explain that it's a marketing technique that the left should be employing. But that's it for me, ladies and gents. I just thought this was a pertinent little read, and I hope you got something out of it. If you would, go ahead and click the link and go check out some of the other things that are written on this particular blog, because he does a lot of cool little reversals where, as I've implied before, if you were to simply take an article written by a racial justice activist in the West and reverse the positions of the races, the position becomes very clear. But that's it for me. Thanks for being here, and as usual, stay safe, good luck, and goodbye.